The last part for today is going to be data visualizations. And R is very strong in creating really high quality data visualizations that are ready for publication. These visualizations can be both static or dynamic. Today we will only focus on static visualizations. And the workhorse package for data visualization in R is ggplot2. R also has some built-in plotting tools in base R. However, they have very obvious drawbacks. And as soon as you're plotting something that is even a little bit more complex than a scatter plot, you will run into limitations pretty quickly. ggplot, on the other hand, allows you almost infinite flexibility in specifying the aesthetics of your plots. ggplot builds around the idea that graphics have a grammar. And the idea is that each graph in R is kind of specified by three main layers, where the first layer is the data that is to be used. Then on top of this, you add the aesthetics, like what are the dimensions like X and Y that should be plotted, what is like the size and the color and so on. And then finally, a geometry layer that says what type of plot would we actually like to generate. Do we want to have a scatter plot or a histogram or a line plot and so on. And so the basic syntax is you call ggplot and you give it the data from which you would like to generate a plot. You specify the aesthetics, and then you add layers on top. And the first layer here will be geometry, but then there could be additional layers, for example, for background, coloring, labels, and so on. And you can save the plot as an object and then further manipulate this as you go on. So for example, you could plot the intermediate object, but then save it, and then later add additional layers if you want to create a more nuanced plot on top of that. So just to create a simple scatter plot, we would start with the colonial origins data again. This contains data for each country on GDP and the level of legal protections that it offers. So we would supply the data set as the first argument to ggplot. And then as aesthetics, we define the dimensions X is legal protection and Y should be GDP. And then we add the geometric points, which says it should just draw the relationship between X and Y as points on a grid. And the result will be this very simple scatter plot. One thing I should add is that you don't need to have the aesthetics specified within ggplot, within the ggplot command. You can just have the ggplot command with the data as a separate layer and then add an aesthetics layer on top of that. So if you would like to have some more aesthetics added to this, you can also add aesthetics at each layer that you're adding. So if you want to have something that should affect how the geometric points should be displayed, you just add an aesthetic option inside here. And here we say we would like to have log the size of the points proportional to the GDP of the country. And now we can see that as log GDP increases in the Y dimension, the size of the points increases. And here on the side, you can see that ggplot automatically generates a legend that shows what are the different sizes of points mean in terms of GDP. And this is a particularly strong also feature of ggplot, is that it additionally it automatically adds legends and adjusts the axis to make your plot look as easily understandable as possible. If you instead want to have country names instead of points, this would be something where you change the geometry layer. So instead of geom points, you would add a geom text layer. And since you have specified in the aesthetics what should be the label, geom text knows that it should now take the country name and use this as when displaying the point. So instead of drawing a point now, it just writes the label of each country code. And also generally, every geometry text has its, or every geometry layer has its own requirements for which aesthetics need to be provided. So for example, if you're having a bar, if you're drawing a histogram, you don't need an X and Y dimension because the histogram plots the frequency against the X dimension. So in this case, you would not need to specify a Y dimension, right? On the other hand, if you only specify X dimension, but you want to draw a scatter plot, then R will not allow you to do that because the Y dimension is required in order to draw a two-dimensional scatter plot. If you'd like to have a line plot instead of dots, you would just add a geom line layer. And this could be useful, for example, if you're thinking about a time series plot. So it will now look like this. Something that's very useful is plotting regression lines. And here we we see that ggplot really allows you to add layers on top of each other. So you can have a scatter plot as before. And here what we do is we first create the fitted values from the regression where we regressed GDP on legal protection. We save the fitted values, and then we create a ggplot scatter plot, which is the first two lines here with the geom point and the red dots. And then we just add a fourth layer on top of this, where we add a line that uses the fitted values and just plots the fitted values against legal protection, and the Y dimension is just the fitted values from the regression. And by adding this extra line on top, we now have the scatter plot as before, and we have the regression fit plotted over the scatter plot. If you would like to specify axes and titles, you can just simply add this as additional layers to your plot. You can add GG title, X lab, Y lab, and you can add additional layers where you just limit or extend the axis, Y and X axis. So this would look like this if we, for example, change the X axis to go from 0 to 10 and the Y from 5 to 10. If instead of a scatter plot, you would like to have a histogram, as I mentioned before, since a histogram plots the frequency in the Y dimension, you don't need to specify a Y dimension. So we just, for example, specify the legal protection, and then we generate a histogram. And what this would do is it would then just show the density of, for example, the number of countries at each legal protection level in our data. And we also add a new title, X and Y labels. And you can see here now, we have generated this simple histogram of the density of legal protection index. If you want to have a bar plot, for example, you would like to plot the magnitude of your coefficients, like you want to have them right next to each other, you can add a geom bar layer. And here we supply as data, we supply the coefficients from our estimate. And then we say the aesthetics should be, the Y dimension should be the aesthetics, so the magnitude should be the height of the bar. And the X dimension should just be the different coefficients. And term is just the name of the coefficient here in this data set. And then geom bar, we would just specify stat to be identity. And what this does is, instead of plotting the count or the frequency of each term or of each coefficient, because each of them is only one, so it will not be very informative. But if we say identity, it would just plot the actual value, since you only have one coefficient per coefficient. And then again, we add title and labels, and this will just give us this bar plot of the coefficients from our regression. Now, when we have regression coefficients, we would also like to see error bars, and we can easily add those as an additional layer by using a geom error bar layer, where we inside specify as aesthetics what should be the minimum and the maximum of these error bars, and this should be, of course, the estimate plus minus the confidence interval, so plus minus 1.96 times the standard error, and then this should be in red with width and size as specified. And we add this on top feature of the bar plot, and now we can see the error bars on top. And you can also see that the axes have been automatically adjusted to display the entire error bar. If you want to add colors, you should notice that you need to specify in the aesthetics that you want to have your colors being proportional to one of your variables. So, for example, if colors should be relative to log settler mortality, you need to specify this in the aesthetics. And then later you can add layers where you specify how exactly colors should be proportional to settler mortality. In this case, we say that settler mortality should be a gradient going from green to red, and kind of the higher settler mortality is, the more it should be red on the scatter plot. This is how this would then look like. We have the scatter plot as before, but now we have this kind of additional dimension of information where we have plotted the settler mortality as a third variable as the color of these plots. And here we see also a legend that shows us exactly what is the measure of settler mortality for each like kind of like level of color gradient. Here to have an additional example, we just go back to the histogram, and of course you can also just say that if you have the histogram, you just want to have the color, which is going to be the border and the filling in a specific color without having it being proportional to something. This will then just look like this. Notice here that I'm also saving the entire object as a object called legal hist, because in the next step I'm just going to add an additional layer to it and to further manipulate this. So here we have just set the color to black and the filling to red. But now let's say we would like to add a theme. So we would like to make our plot in line with the layout of a newspaper, for example. And there's some default themes already available, but there's also many more in the package GG themes, which allows you to kind of, instead of specifying everything yourself, you basically directly take the layout from that follows a popular theme or so, like a popular newspaper or a magazine or a scientific journal, and displays it in the same style. So here what we do is we take our legal protection score histogram, and then we add the theme economist, which makes the histogram in the same style as a histogram would be in the newspaper The Economist. And here we can see that it is still like red with a black border, but the background has been changed. Now, the last part is something that I think is very important if you want to show results for different subgroups. And this is called facets. And facets also just additional layers you can add on top. And what facets do is they allow you to split your plot into subgroups and, for example, show a scatter plot separately for, let's say, male and female. And what you need to do is you need to specify what is the dimension that you would like to have your plot split by. So what I'm doing here is I'm generating a new variable. Oh, and this variable needs to be a categoric factor variable. Of course, you cannot split by a continuous variable because it wouldn't know where to draw the line. So what I'm doing here is I generate a new variable called rich, where I just say every country that has more than a median GDP is a rich country. And then I use the scatter plot of legal protection against GDP, and add a new layer called facet grid, where I specify that the grid should be split in different columns by the variable rich. And what this does, it just splits the plot into two subplots, one for rich countries and one for poor countries. And as you can see here, the labeling is kind of off, so these should be in the other, in a different order, but I guess you understand the point. Since we used facet grid, we can also, of course, add different rows. So for example, you could have male and female, and then you could have split by white collar and blue collar to give a kind of like a 2x2 plot of different subgroups of the population. So this was a very quick overview. However, there is a lot more to learn about ggplot. ggplot2 has a website. There is a guide that's a little bit less extensive. And of course, there's also a cheat sheet if you just need to know what kind of layers you could use. And the possibilities are really endless. Like you can plot like really complex graphics. Like for example, you could display information on a world map or on a country map of different counties, etc. So whatever you have in mind, what you need for your thesis or whatever you're working on, ggplot should be able to generate this.